How to master skills for the TOEFL IBT speaking. Advanced. Unit 53. Art methods. Listening. Listen to a lecture and take notes.
I'd like to point out something about art from the past. In previous eras, making art was expensive. Most artists required patrons merely to afford the paint, canvas, and everything else they needed. And these patrons, naturally, kept most of the artwork in their homes for their own personal viewing. This made art inaccessible to most people. The artists, quite understandably, didn't appreciate this, so they came up with two ways to enable the public to admire their work. For one, many artists began using cheaper materials. This let them work without a sponsor. This way, they could produce the art they wanted to and also retain possession of their art. They were then free to display it wherever they wanted to. This naturally permitted many more people to see their work. Of course, one drawback to this approach was that the lower quality of the paint and other materials meant their work often faded quickly. Fortunately, many of these works can now be restored using modern methods. Another thing artists did was to display their art both outdoors and in public places. Remember that artists didn't just do paintings. They did statues, sculptures, and many other kinds of art. Take a look at any cathedral. There is art everywhere. Look at the statues and the stained glass window in them. They're all works of art, and consider one of the greatest examples of art anywhere: Michelangelo's work in the Sistine Chapel. How many thousands or millions of people have seen his artwork? He attained what most artists strive for the greatest number of people to admire his work.
Unit 54. Animal cooperation. Listening. Listen to a lecture and take notes.
While we often point out how humans benefit by cooperating with one another, we should also note that many animals act in concert too. In fact, without cooperating with one another, many animals would be much less well off. For example, many animals cooperate to maximize their protection from predators, while others work together in order to locate and exploit new food sources. Let's think about deer first. With their antlers, you'd imagine they wouldn't need any protection. But what about does, fawns, and older deer? Wolves and other predators can take down a deer easily, especially by hunting in packs. So what do deer do? Well, one defensive measure they use is to feed in groups. This helps keep them safe from predators. How? Well, for one, they can alert one another more quickly when predators are nearby, which allows younger, older, or weaker deer to hide or escape. Second, there's safety in numbers. Predators are far more likely to attack a single animal than a large group of them. Now, how about honeybees? They work together too. You've heard of the honeybees dance, right? That's a textbook case of animal cooperation. When looking for food, honeybees all head in different directions. When they find a potential food source, they return to the hive. Then they perform a complicated dance, which scientists believe actually gives the direction, distance, and amount of food located. This allows the bees to abandon unpromising searches and move on to food sources that are closer and which will be able to provide more food for the hive.
Unit 55. Pollinator attraction. Listening. Listen to a lecture and take notes. Let's move on to pollination and how flowers attract pollinators. Most flowers get pollinated by insects, so let's focus on them. You've probably noticed that flowers have their own distinct appearances and smells. Don't think those are for your benefit, okay? They actually look and smell those ways in order to attract insects to pollinate them. Allow me to explain in detail. One major attractor, unsurprisingly, is appearance. It's the most important one of all. Some insects can see colors well. So, there are some colors that, depending upon the insect, make it just want to stop and sit down on the flower. For example, many butterflies are attracted to the colors red and yellow, two of the three primary colors. Think of the painted daisy. Here's a picture. It's got red petals and a yellow center. Butterflies simply won't miss being attracted to that flower. It's irresistible. So remember, that's why we see so many different colors of flowers. They are attracting various kinds of insects to pollinate them. Odor is the second most common attractor used. Unfortunately for flowers, most insects can't differentiate colors. They're essentially colorblind, but they can recognize different scents, that is, smells. Take the moth. You know, those insects that look like butterflies but which always appear at night. Well, they're attracted to, sweet smells. Jasmine is one example. Now, get a load of this. Jasmine produces a strong, sweet smell, but only at night, which is the perfect time to attract moths. Amazing, huh? So, the moths, having been attracted, will be able to pollinate the jasmine plants. And that's nature at work. Unit 56. Photography. Listening. Listen to a lecture and take notes.
We all know the saying that a picture's worth 1,000 words. That's probably why many of you are into photography. And you should all know that, depending upon how a photographer takes his picture, he can make his subject look sympathetic or make it appear dark and ominous. Think about how photographers in different centuries portrayed industrialization. Their attitudes in the 19th and 20th centuries were almost completely different, which is reflected in their work. Photography as we know it was invented in the 19th century, and this is important, for this was the century when industrialism was really starting to take off. But you know what? These advances frightened people. They thought the world was changing too quickly. So photographers were often quite critical of industrialism. They took more photographs of nature and people instead. They focused mostly on humanity at the expense of industrialism. Those pictures that did show industrialism often emphasized people's dirty, worn, and hopeless faces after they'd worked in the factories all day or other such negative representations. The 20th century, however, saw a dramatic change in attitudes. People began to, celebrate industrialism. Photographers, therefore, started taking more pictures of machines and other tools of industrialization. Not only did they increase the numbers of pictures they took, but they also made sure the pictures showed machines in the best possible light. Here, see this picture inside an automobile factory? Notice how clean everything is and how the people are smiling as they do their jobs. This picture is typical of 20th century's attitude toward industrialization. It meant to honor industrialization, not to demonize it.
Unit 57. Advertisements. Listening. Listen to a lecture and take notes. Did everyone do their reading last night? Excellent. Then I'd like to quickly review a couple of the advertising techniques you read about. As you should recall, two techniques were primarily focused on. They were the direct and indirect methods of persuasion. I'd like to give a couple of examples of them now. All ads try to persuade people to purchase the products which they're promoting. The direct method is one popular way. When using this, advertisers note the features of their products that make them extraordinary and different from other similar products. They might cite various facts and statistics that will tell viewers exactly why they should go out and purchase that particular product. For example, a car manufacturer using direct advertising techniques might stress how safe the car is according to recent statistics. Or it might mention the car's gas mileage and note how it's much more economical than its competitors. On the other hand, there is also the indirect method of advertising. Here, advertisers attempt to persuade customers by using association. They might show the results of using or purchasing their product. For example, let's go back to car ads. Perhaps the car being sold is rather ordinary. Well, the manufacturer is going to show people smiling while they're driving. The mom and dad will be in the front listening to music while the kids in the back will be playing games or looking out the window to admire the scenery. That's an example of indirect advertising. The company's trying to make potential buyers think they'll be as happy as the people in the ad if they purchase that company's product. Unit 58. Positive and negative reinforcement. Listening. Listen to a lecture and take notes.
I'm sure you all have certain things you absolutely loathe doing. I have a few myself. So, how do you convince yourself to do them? Are you the kind of person who uses, well, positive reinforcement? Or do you rely upon negative reinforcement to get yourself to do these undesirable activities? I'm sure many of you aren't morning people, right? Then consider a worker who hates getting up early in the morning. Unfortunately, his job starts at 7:30, so he's got to wake up by 6. Now, how does he convince himself to get out of bed? One way is to use positive reinforcement. This is when you add some kind of behavior or reward to get yourself to do something. Our worker loves donuts, but he doesn't eat them very often. However, as a reward for getting up early, he eats a donut for breakfast each morning prior to leaving home for work. That's positive reinforcement at work. Now, shall we consider negative reinforcement? This is the process of removing some kind of behavior or punishment in order to convince yourself or another to do something. What does that mean? Here's an example. Let's say that another worker who must get up early hates showering in the morning. He simply can't stand it. He feels like he's punishing himself by getting in the shower at 6 a.m., which makes him dread getting up that early. Well, by using negative reinforcement, he takes a shower at night before going to bed. That removes a behavior he dislikes in the morning, thereby making it more likely that he'll get up out of bed and go to work.
Unit 59. Film shots. Listening. Listen to a lecture and take notes.
Movie directors have many techniques to convey various messages to their audiences. Messages can be passed to the audience without actual dialogue. In other words, you don't need words to say everything. Even camera shots can get across various meanings. Some directors use the angle of the camera, called a shot, to strengthen various feelings or to add more significance to a scene. For example, one common method that directors use is to angle up the camera. That means you're looking upwards at the person from below him or her. What kind of image would this convey? Think about it. If you're looking up at someone, you're typically admiring a powerful person, or at least someone very important. So these low-angle shots give an impression of power. A director filming, say, the Queen of England might use this method. She's not the tallest of women, yet the impression one would get from a low-angle shot of her is of a woman looking down on her subjects as she stands above them. Powerful indeed. So if there are low-angle shots, then naturally there are high-angle shots, right? Of course there are. What's the message here? Well, how do you normally feel if you're looking down? Let me give you an example first. Say you're filming a man lost in the desert. He feels helpless and he's all alone. You'd film him from a down angle. In other words, you'd be elevated above him. This would help to show the utter hopelessness of his situation because you'd show not only him, but the vast wasteland of the desert all around him. Everyone got that?
Unit 60. Positive thinking. Listening. Listen to a lecture and take notes.
Thinking positively is one of the most important things people can do. Positive thinking, as opposed to negative thinking, can actually drastically affect the way people react to various situations. You might find these examples rather interesting. Everyone watches the weather forecast, right? Well, I watched it this morning, and the meteorologist said there was a 50% chance of sunny weather today. That, of course, means there is also a 50% chance of cloudy or rainy weather. But he didn't say anything about clouds or rain, did he? No, he only said the word sunny. Now, how many of you saw today's weather report? Okay, a few. And how many of you brought umbrellas with you? None, just as I expected. When the weatherman says there's a 50% chance of cloudy weather, most people will take umbrellas with them. However, if he says there's a 50% chance of sunny weather, very few people will carry umbrellas. That's positive thinking at work. Here's another example. It's flu season these days, so perhaps you decide to visit the pharmacy for some medicine. You see two different bottles. On the front of one, it reads that this medicine has a 90% chance of treating a cold effectively. However, on the other bottle, it read that it only has a 10% chance of not being able to treat a cold. It's the same thing, right? It's just phrased differently. However, in a research experiment carried out, far more people purchased the medicine that promised a 90% success rate. Why? Well, its message was more positive. Simply put, people react much better to positive messages than to negative ones.
How to master skills for the TOEFL IBT speaking. Advanced. Speaking section directions. In this section of the test, you will demonstrate your ability to speak about a variety of topics. You will answer 6 questions by speaking into the microphone. Answer each of the questions as completely as possible. In questions 1 and 2, you will speak about familiar topics. Your response will be scored on your ability to speak clearly and coherently about the topics. In questions 3 and 4, you will respond to questions based on what you have read and heard. First, you will read a short text. The text will go away, and you will then listen to a talk on the same topic. You will then be asked a question about what you have read and heard. You will need to combine appropriate information from the text and the talk to provide a complete answer to the question. Your response will be scored on your ability to speak clearly and coherently and on your ability to accurately convey information about what you read and heard. In questions 5 and 6, you will respond to questions based on what you have heard. First, you will listen to part of a conversation or a lecture. You will then be asked a question about what you have heard. Your response will be scored on your ability to speak clearly and coherently and on your ability to accurately convey information about what you heard. You may take notes while you read and while you listen to the conversations and lectures. You may use your notes to help prepare your responses. Your notes will not be scored. Listen carefully to the directions for each question. The directions will not be shown on the paper.
Number 2. In this question, you will be asked to give an opinion about a familiar topic. After you have the question, you will have 15 seconds to prepare your response and 45 seconds to speak.
Some people enjoy watching television. Others prefer to read the newspaper or use the internet. Which activity do you prefer to do and why? Use specific reasons and examples to support your preference. Please begin speaking after the beep.
Number 4. In this question, you will read a short passage on an academic subject and then listen to a talk on the same topic. You will then answer a question using information from both the reading passage and the talk. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak.
Now read the following passage about sampling error. You have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture on this topic in a statistics class. As you listen, be sure to take notes.
When reading surveys or studies, it's integral that you pay attention to the sampling error. No studies are perfect, but scientists try making them as perfect as possible. And the sampling error records the chance of error inherent in the study. For example, I read about a scientist trying to determine the average size of the fish in a local lake. What did he do? He went out in a boat with a net, caught some fish, and measured them to determine their average size. However, his net was too big, so he couldn't catch any really small fish. Therefore, his study wasn't truly accurate, was it? He had to provide a sampling error to let readers know how accurate or inaccurate his research was. Also, it's an election year, so there are lots of political surveys nowadays. Did you notice that survey where the presumed front-runner for president was running neck and neck with the other candidates? However, every other survey has him listed at least 12 points ahead. What happened? Well, the survey was done during the afternoon. This means that, since it was a phone survey calling people's homes, the survey got answers from a disproportionate number of housewives. It wasn't a truly random sample of the population. That's why it had a larger than usual sampling error.
Now get ready to answer the question. The professor describes the results of 2 recent surveys. Explain how the results are related to sampling error. Please begin speaking after the beep.
Number 6. In this question, you will listen to part of a lecture. You will then be asked to summarize important information from the lecture. After you hear the question, you will have 20 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class.
I'm sure none of you have any children of your own, but I'd still like to point out some aspects of how children learn. While their minds are such wonderful things, young children can sometimes become quite mistaken when trying to learn new things. In fact, sometimes they generalize too much, while other times they make things too specific. First, let's talk about how they generalize. Children are always curious to know the names of different things. You've probably heard the question, "Mommy, what's that?" hundreds of times if you've spent any time at all around children, and their parents are often quick to answer. But here's a problem. Perhaps a child sees a horse and asks what it is. The parent responds that it's a horse. The child remembers that, but the next time he sees another animal walking on all fours, he calls that animal a horse too. What's happened? The child has generalized too much and assumed that any animal with 4 legs was a horse. Of course, children can sometimes make words too specific. I have a personal example concerning that. I gave my daughter a doll for her 3rd birthday. She loved that doll a lot and took it with her everywhere. One day, one of her friends visited the house and brought a doll of her own. My daughter asked what it was and was told that it was a doll. She refused to believe it since she thought that the only doll was her own. In fact, it took her months before she would actually acknowledge that anyone besides her had a doll. Talk about being too specific.
Now get ready to answer the question. Using points and examples from the lecture, explain the 2 ways children make mistakes when they are learning. Please begin speaking after the beep.
Number 2. In this question, you will be asked to give an opinion about a familiar topic. After you have the question, you will have 15 seconds to prepare your response and 45 seconds to speak.
Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? It is important to have a friend with different interests from yourself. Give specific reasons and examples to support your opinion. Please begin speaking after the beep.
Number 4. In this question, you will read a short passage on an academic subject and then listen to a talk on the same topic. You will then answer a question using information from both the reading passage and the talk. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak.
Now read the following passage about animal tameability. You have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture on this topic in a zoology class. As you listen, be sure to take notes.
Why is it that some animals are more easily domesticated than others? For example, why have cows become domesticated but not lions, for example? Well, there are numerous factors involved in domesticating animals, but I want to focus on a couple of the most important right now. One of the most crucial aspects involved is the animal's disposition. By that, I mean, how pleasant is the animal? Is it aggressive or not? Well, let me compare dogs and wolves. We've domesticated the former, but not the latter. Dogs, in general, have well earned their moniker as man's best friend. Most dogs, not all, but most, have pleasant dispositions and enjoy being around humans. Wolves, on the other hand, tend to be aggressive and may often attack or even kill humans. Another point to consider is how well the animal can adapt to accepting a human as its leader. Dogs are typically very willing to recognize that humans are their, pack leaders, for lack of a better expression. Dogs willingly submit to human leadership. In contrast, though, are wolves. Most wolves will not submit, which makes it virtually impossible for them to be domesticated. Some individual wolves have been domesticated, but as a species, it's all but impossible.
Now get ready to answer the question. The professor describes the difference in trying to domesticate dogs and wolves. Explain how this relates to animal tameability. Please begin speaking after the beep.
Number 6. In this question, you will listen to part of a lecture. You will then be asked to summarize important information from the lecture. After you hear the question, you will have 20 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak.
Now listen to part of a lecture in an art history class.
So, that concludes my discussion on medieval painting. Let's move to the Renaissance. There were many differences between medieval and Renaissance paintings, but the biggest was in the use of perspective. In medieval paintings, the pictures were mostly two-dimensional. They never used perspective, but Renaissance artists added perspective, giving their works a three-dimensional aspect. So how did they manage to add perspective to their art? Art historians have two theories. The first is that they began using tools when creating artwork. Some artists would use mirrors when they painted. In some cases, they would reflect, say, a basket of fruit in the mirror and would then actually trace the lines around the reflection of the mirror. This is how many of them learned to draw perspective. Once they traced the lines, they could then transfer their work to the canvas, where they were able to give their art a more three-dimensional appearance. Another school of thought centers on the development of oil paintings. It was only in the 15th century that oil paint was invented. One advantage it had over other paints was that it dried very slowly. Not only that, but oil paints are also translucent, so light is able to shine through the paint. These two factors combined to enable artists to add perspective to their paintings. How? Well, the slow-drying, translucent paints gave artists enough time to create paintings with more depth. They could paint over the first coat by using different colors and shades, thereby producing works that weren't linear, but were instead three-dimensional in appearance. In other words, they were able to build perspective into their paintings thanks to the paint itself.
Now get ready to answer the question. Using points and examples from the lecture, explain the two ways artists in the Renaissance used perspective in their paintings. Please begin speaking after the beep. Task 2. Sample response.
I'm the kind of person who enjoys watching television. The first reason is that watching TV relaxes me. When I'm resting, I don't like to do anything but sit on the sofa and watch a good television program. Watching TV takes no effort at all, and it's also an effective way to get rid of stress at the same time. Another reason is that I actually learn a lot from watching TV. Simply put, I watch many educational programs and even the news at times. Nowadays, there are so many channels and shows that are specifically geared toward learning. Since I learn better through visual methods than with textual methods, it really makes sense for me to watch television as much as possible.
Task 4. Sample response.
The lecturer describes the results of two recent surveys. The first was done by a scientist measuring the sizes of fish in a lake. The scientist used a net to capture fish and then averaged their sizes. However, the lecturer points out that, due to the net's small size, many tiny fish escaped. This relates to the reading in that the survey had a sampling error, which is the possibility of error in the study. Since he couldn't capture any small fish, the study wasn't truly random but had a sampling error. The lecturer's second example is of a recent political survey whose results were different from what other polls were showing. The lecturer explains that it was conducted during the day, so there wasn't a random sampling because a higher than normal number of housewives answered. This caused the sampling error to be high, making the survey difficult to trust.
Task 6. Sample response.
The professor's lecture mentions that children often make mistakes when they're learning. First of all, he covers children's tendencies to generalize too much. The example that he gives is that a child sees a horse and asks what it is. When told that it's a horse, the child then assumes that all four-legged animals are horses. So, the next time it sees, for example, a dog, it might call the dog a horse, simply because it has four legs. Next, the professor mentions that children sometimes become too specific. He relates a story about his daughter getting a doll for her birthday. In her mind, her present was the only doll in the world. Even when she saw her friend's doll, she refused to call it that for the longest time. What happened is that she had thought the word had a very specific rather than broad meaning.
Task 2. Sample response.
In my opinion, I agree that it's important to have a friend who has interests different than my own. For one, thanks to that friend, I could become interested in various things that I might have never known about. For example, last year, one of my friends got me into skiing, which is something I had never considered until I met her. This has helped me develop my other interests. Additionally, sometimes I'd just like to hear about something that I have no knowledge in. In fact, when my friends start talking about their interests that are different than mine, I usually just listen and try to learn from them. This helps me get both educated and entertained while I'm having a conversation.
Task 4. Sample response.
During his lecture, the professor says some animals are easier to domesticate than others. He compares dogs and wolves to illustrate his point. According to the professor, the animal's disposition is crucial to domesticating it. He notes that dogs really are man's best friend, while stating that wolves are both aggressive and hostile towards humans. The professor next points out that the animals must be willing to accept humans as their leaders before being domesticated. He notes that dogs will do this, but wolves in general won't. These 2 points are related to the reading in that they describe the tameability of animals. Tameability refers to the factors involved relating to humans' abilities to domesticate animals. Ones with pleasant attitudes and those willing to let humans be their leaders may be domesticated. These are dogs. Wolves, however, don't possess these characteristics, so it's almost impossible to domesticate them.
Task 6. Sample response.
The professor looks into the 2 theories that art historians have as to how Renaissance artists were able to add perspective to their paintings, while medieval artists did not. The first theory is that artists began using tools like mirrors to help them create their works. The professor points out that some artists would reflect an image in a mirror and then draw on the mirror itself to create perspective. They could then transfer their drawings to the canvas and subsequently paint over them. The second theory is that the invention of oil paints permitted perspective to be used. Due to the nature of oil paint, which dries slowly, artists had more time to work on their paintings. Before the paint dried, they could add second coats that were of different shades or colors, which then gave their paintings depth, thereby adding perspective to the paintings.